My 3 children stood by the coat rack with their plates still empty, watching their cousins get seconds of prime rib 40 feet away. My sister smoothed the tablecloth in front of her like she was straightening a crown. "They can eat when the guests are done," she said, smiling the exact smile she'd used on me since we were girls. My father, sitting at the head of a table in the birthday crown my daughter had made him out of construction paper, simply nodded. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at my children. He picked up his fork and went back to his steak. I walked to that coat rack. I picked up 3 small coats, one with a broken zipper I still hadn't fixed, one 2 sizes too big because it was a hand-me-down, one with a hole in the pocket my son kept sticking his thumb through. I helped my youngest into hers, and I said, loud enough for the whole private room to hear, "We'll eat at home, where nobody has to earn their dinner." Nobody stopped us. Nobody came after us into that parking lot. And as I buckle my son into his car seat with my hands shaking so hard I could barely work the clasp, I promised myself something. I didn't know yet that less than 2 years later, that promise would cost my sister everything she'd spent a decade building. And it would start with a manila folder she didn't know I'd find. My name is Linnea Thorne, and before I tell you what was in that folder, I need you to understand exactly how long I'd been the daughter nobody planned in her around. I was 26 when my husband left. Trent Doyle didn't leave dramatically. No yelling, no slammed doors. He left the way some men do, quietly, over the course of a year. Until one day the closet was half empty, and there was a note on the kitchen counter that said he needed space to figure things out. He figured them out 2 states away with a woman from his old job. I found out I was still pregnant with our 3rd child 4 days after he was gone. I had a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a baby on the way, and a checking account with $180 in it. I didn't tell my family right away. I already knew how that conversation would go because I'd watched it happen to other parts of my life 100 times before. My sister Marguerite had married into money. Her husband ran a chain of dealerships across 3 counties, and from the moment she said I do in a dress that cost more than my first car, something shifted in how our parents looked at the 2 of us. It wasn't cruel, not at first. It was smaller than that. It was the way our mother, before she passed, used to say, "Well, Marguerite's family has a lot going on," when she wanted an excuse to visit her grandchildren on a Tuesday instead of driving the extra 20 minutes to see mine. It was the way our father, Desmond, would ask Marguerite's kids about their piano recitals and soccer tournaments in detail, and ask my kids, "You keeping busy?" By the time my divorce was final, I was renting a 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store, splitting 1 bedroom between my daughters, Faye and Della, while my son Beckett slept in a crib wedged into a corner of my own room. I worked mornings at a medical billing office, and evenings doing inventory at a warehouse 3 nights a week because childcare for 3 kids on 1 income wasn't a plan. It was a math problem I never solved. My sister, meanwhile, was renovating a kitchen island for the 2nd time in 4 years and posting about family game nights in a living room bigger than my entire apartment. I remember one particular Christmas back when Beckett was still an infant, when the difference between our 2 lives got laid out so plainly I couldn't pretend not to see it anymore. Marguerite's kids unwrapped presents that filled half her living room: a gaming console, matching bicycles, a dollhouse the size of a real piece of furniture. My father handed my daughters a single wrapped set of coloring books to share and told them with a warm smile that somehow made it worse, "You girls don't need as much. You're not spoiled like your cousins." I said nothing. I told myself it was easier that way, that making a scene over coloring books would only prove whatever unspoken thing they already believed about me, that I was bitter, that I couldn't let things go, that I made everything harder than it needed to be. So, I smiled too, and thanked him and drove home wondering when exactly I'd agreed to be the daughter who accepted less without comment. I want to be clear about something because I know how this can sound. I never once asked my family for money. Not when a transmission went out on my car and I took 2 buses to work for 5 months. Not when Beckett needed a specialist for his ears and the copays alone nearly broke me. Not even when Della's second-grade teacher gently pulled me aside to ask if things were stable at home because my daughter had started bringing crackers to school in a sandwich bag, unwilling to say why. I never asked. I just quietly kept showing up, kept working, kept telling my kids that love didn't come with a price tag, even while I watched my sister's family get invited to things mine never was. My father's 70th birthday was supposed to be different. He called me himself, which almost never happened. Usually it was Marguerite relaying instructions on his behalf and said, "I want all my grandkids there, Lynn, all of them." I remember standing in my kitchen, holding the phone against my shoulder, while I stirred a pot of the cheapest pasta I could find, feeling something in my chest loosen for the first time in years. All of them. I told my kids we were going to Grandpa's big party, and Della spent 3 nights making him a birthday A out of construction paper and glitter glue because she didn't have money for a gift and wanted to make something instead. Faye picked out her nicest dress, the one from 2 Easters ago that was starting to get short on her. Beckett, who was 5, practiced saying, "Happy birthday, Grandpa," like it was a line in a school play. We drove 90 minutes to the private event. Room Marguerite had booked at some steakhouse with white tablecloths and a maitre d' who looked at my kids' hand-me-down coats like they'd wandered in off the street. I should have known something was wrong the second we walked in and saw the seating chart. There were 2 tables. The big one, near the windows, had place cards with gold script. Marguerite, her husband Preston, Sylvie, my father, a handful of my father's old golf friends. The second table, small and round and pushed almost into the coat closet, had 3 paper name tags taped to plastic placemats. Faye, Della, Beckett. No place card for me at all, like the assumption was I should just stand somewhere. I told myself it was a mistake. I told myself Marguerite had simply run out of room, that it wasn't personal, that I was being oversensitive after years of feeling like the family's afterthought. I sat my kids down at their little table and went to find my sister, who was directing the waitstaff with the easy authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice light. "I think there's been a mix-up with the seating. My kids are kind of tucked away back there." Marguerite didn't even look up from the seating chart in her hand. "It's not a mix-up. The main table's for immediate family and Dad's close friends. There just wasn't room for everyone. Their immediate family, Lynn." She finally looked at me, and there was that smile. The one I'd catalogued 100 times over 30 years, patient and condescending in equal measure. "It's fine. The kids' table is right there. They'll be served after the main course goes out." I want to tell you I fought harder in that moment. I didn't, not yet. I went back inside with my children, and I watched server after server bring out plates for the main table. A rack of lamb for my father, steaks for Preston and Sylvie, a whole seafood tower for Marguerite's husband, while my kids sat with empty placemats watching their cousins eat. Beckett, 5 years old, tugged my sleeve and asked in that clear, carrying voice that little kids have no filter for, "Mommy, when is it our turn?" That's when Marguerite said it, loud enough that the whole room heard, loud enough that I saw 2 of my father's golf friends glance over with visible discomfort. "They can eat when the guests are done." Guests? She called my children guests at their own grandfather's table at a party they'd been personally invited to. I looked at my father. I need you to understand what I was hoping for in that half second. I was hoping he'd say something, anything. A single sentence correcting his other daughter in front of a room full of people. Instead, my father nodded. He picked his fork back up. He went back to his steak like nothing had happened at all. Like his grandchildren weren't sitting 6 feet away with empty plates and confused faces. I have replayed that nod more times than I can count. It wasn't rage that moved me out of that chair, it was clarity. 31 years of small comparisons and quiet exclusions suddenly had a shape, and the shape was that nod. I stood up. I walked to the coat rack. I got Faye's coat, the one 2 sizes too big. I got Della's with the broken zipper. I got Beckett's, the one with the hole in the pocket he liked to stick his thumb through when he was nervous. I helped each of my children into their coats while the whole room watched in that particular silence people use when they know something is happening but don't want to be the one to acknowledge it. "We'll eat at home," I said, "where nobody has to earn their dinner." I didn't slam a door. I didn't cry. Not until I was in the car. I buckled my kids in and Beckett, still not fully understanding, asked if we could get the birthday cake later. I told him we'd have our own cake, and I drove 90 minutes home with my hands aching from gripping the wheel. And I put 3 frozen waffles in the toaster, because it was 10 at night, and that was what we had. Here is what happened in the weeks after, because I promised you a folder, and I need you to understand the silence that came before it. Nobody called. Not my father, not Marjorie, not one of my father's golf friends who'd watched 3 children sit with empty plates. What I got instead, 4 days later, was a text from my Aunt Ronnie, forwarded from a group chat I'd been quietly removed from some time after. The party. Apparently, I had made a scene and embarrassed Dad on a special day by storming out with the children. Marjorie's version of events, it turned out, was that I'd overreacted to a simple seating logistics issue and humiliated the family in front of guests. My father, when I finally reached him on the phone 11 days after his own birthday, sighed the exhausted sigh of a man being unfairly burdened. Lynn, it was one dinner. You didn't have to make it a whole thing. One dinner. I hung up and didn't call again. I want to tell you I handled the months after that with grace. Mostly, I just handled them with exhaustion. Money got tighter. My landlord raised the rent $40 a month, which doesn't sound like much until you're already deciding between the electric bill and new shoes for a growing 7-year-old. I picked up a 4th shift a week at the warehouse. I started skipping lunch most days. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way you do when you've decided your kid's eating well matters more than you eating at all. Faye, who was 10, started noticing things kids that age shouldn't have to notice. And one night she found me at the kitchen table with the bills spread out, and just sat down next to me without saying anything. Like she already understood there wasn't anything to say. There was one week in January that I still think about more than any other. I was short on rent by $230. A number I remember exactly because I did the math on it probably 40 times that week, rearranging bills in my head. Like puzzle pieces that never quite fit. I'd already sold the one piece of jewelry I owned that was worth anything, my grandmother's ring, to a pawn shop 2 towns over, so nobody I knew would see me walk in. I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since Trent left. Not because of the ring itself, but because I understood in that moment how close I actually was to the edge of things. One bad week away from a conversation with my children about where we were going to sleep. I didn't call my father. It didn't even occur to me to try. That, more than anything, tells you exactly how far the distance between us had grown. That same week, Della's 2nd grade teacher called me in for a conference I wasn't expecting. She told me, gently, that Della had started bringing an extra sandwich bag of crackers to school every day and hoarding them in her cubby instead of eating them at lunch. And when the teacher had asked why, my 7-year-old had said she wanted to make sure there was extra in case dinner ran out. I sat in that tiny plastic chair meant for a child, and felt something in me break and reset at the same time. I promised myself, driving home that afternoon, that I would find a way out of survival mode if it took everything I had, because my children were absorbing a kind of scarcity I never wanted them to carry into adulthood the way I had. The person who kept me upright that winter wasn't family. It was my landlord, a woman named Presley Judd, who owned the hardware store below our apartment and had watched my kids grow up climbing the stairs past her front counter. Presley was somewhere past 60, sharp-eyed, the kind of person who noticed when a tenant's lights were on past midnight 3 nights running. She started leaving things outside my door, a bag of the girls' outgrown size clothes from a niece, a casserole because I made too much. Never a word about it after. One evening in February, when I was hauling groceries up the stairs with Beckett on my hip, she stopped me in the stairwell and said, "You know, you don't have to do all of this like you're the only person in the world who's ever been broken alone." I told her, half joking, half not, that it sure felt that way. She laughed, not unkindly, and said something I didn't fully appreciate until months later. "Family isn't the people who share your last name, Linnea. It's the people who show up when there's nothing in it for them." Presley became the person I talked to when things got hard, and eventually the person who helped me see a path out of the hole I was in. She knew a bookkeeper who needed part-time help entering numbers, work I could do some evenings from my kitchen table once the kids were down. It paid better than the warehouse, and it used a part of my brain that had been dormant since before Beckett was born. I still remember the first week of that work, staying up past midnight after 3 kids were finally asleep, squinting at spreadsheets on a second-hand laptop with a cracked corner, and feeling something I hadn't felt in years: competence. Not gratitude for scraps, not relief at surviving another month, just the plain, steady satisfaction of being good at something and getting paid fairly for it. Within 4 months, I'd picked up 2 more small business clients doing the same thing, mostly through word of mouth after the first client mentioned to a friend that her books had never been cleaner. Within 8, I'd quietly built a modest little bookkeeping practice of my own, run out of that same kitchen table, one spreadsheet at a time. I dropped the warehouse shifts first, then eventually the billing office job too. The day I realized my client income had finally quietly surpassed both combined. I didn't celebrate with anything extravagant. I bought the kids a real dinner out at a diner 2 towns over, let each of them order whatever they wanted off the menu without checking the price first, and watched Beckett's face when the waitress asked if he wanted a milkshake, and I said yes before he even finished asking. It's a small memory. It's one of my favorites. I want to be honest about something because this part of the story matters as much as anything else. Rebuilding wasn't a straight line. There were months the client work slowed, and I panicked and picked up a part-time shift again, just to be safe. There were nights I sat with the girls' report cards and felt guilty that I hadn't been able to sign Della up for the gymnastics class she'd been asking about for a year because it still wasn't in the budget. But slowly, month over month, the ground under us got steadier. I stopped flinching every time the phone rang with an unknown number, worried it was a collections call. I started an emergency fund, just a few $100s at first, that I refused to touch even when it was tempting. My children started sleeping through the night without me hearing them get up to check if the lights were still on because they'd started to trust on some level kids understand before they can articulate it that things were becoming okay. It was through that work, oddly enough, that everything with my family finally came apart because one of the small businesses I started keeping books for, purely by coincidence, was a used furniture consignment shop that Marguerite's husband's dealership group used for staging their model home showroom. Part of my job was reconciling every vendor invoice against the supporting paperwork attached to it, and on one of the larger reimbursement packages, someone in the dealership's office had stapled in backup documentation that had nothing to do with furniture at all. Old wire transfer confirmations, filed there by mistake because they'd been reimbursed through the same general account. One slow Tuesday afternoon, cross-referencing an old invoice for a discrepancy, I found a name I recognized on one of those transfer confirmations, except the amount stopped me cold. It was our mother's name, Eleanor Thorne. Our mother, who had died 6 years earlier, had left behind a modest trust. Not a fortune, but a real sum, meant to be split evenly between Marguerite's children and mine for their educations. I had signed paperwork on it years ago and never thought about it again, trusting, the way you trust family, that it was sitting untouched in an account somewhere waiting for my kids to turn 18. It was not sitting untouched. Over 3 years, in amounts small enough to avoid drawing obvious attention, funds had been quietly redirected out of that trust and into an account connected to Marguerite's husband's dealership expansion, the same expansion that had paid for the second kitchen renovation, the private steakhouse room, the seafood tower my children never got a taste. At first I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation because that's what you do when you've spent your whole life giving your family the benefit of the doubt, even when the doubt kept costing you something. I pulled the older invoices. I cross-referenced dates against the consignment shop's own ledgers, against dealership expansion announcements Marguerite's husband had probably posted online, against the exact months our mother's trust statements had gone conspicuously quiet on the one account I'd never had reason to check closely. The pattern held every single time. It wasn't a clerical error repeated by accident. It was a decision made and remade 3 times a year for 3 years. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that night after the kids were asleep, staring at numbers on a screen that didn't add up to anything except a decade of quiet theft, dressed up as generosity toward one side of the family. I thought about Beckett asking when it was our turn to eat. I thought about my father's nod. Over the next few days, I printed every page that mattered: the transfer confirmations, the trust statements, the dealership expansion records, and put them into a plain manila folder I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk underneath a stack of client invoices where nobody would think to look. I didn't tell a single person outside that apartment what was in it, not even Presley, not yet. I just carried that folder with me to the estate attorney's office 3 weeks later, set it down on his desk, and said, "I need you to tell me if I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing." I didn't call Marjorie. I didn't call my father. I called an estate attorney named Dorian Voss, who Presley had recommended months earlier for something else entirely, and I brought him the printouts. He confirmed within a week what I already suspected. The trust documents required equal disbursement. My signature had never authorized any redirection, and what he was looking at, in his words, has a paper trail a first-year associate could follow. He said the word fiduciary a lot. He said the word documented even more. We requested a full accounting through the trust's attorney of record, which forced everything into the light whether my family wanted it there or not. Marjorie tried at first to frame it as a misunderstanding, a temporary bridge loan between family funds that she'd always intended to repay. The paperwork told a different story. No loan agreement, no interest terms, no repayment schedule, just 3 years of transfers that happened to stop exactly when the dealership expansion was fully funded. My father, when confronted by the trust attorney, admitted he'd signed off on some of the transfers without fully reading what he was authorizing. Trusting Marguerite the same he'd always trusted her, the same way he'd never once had to earn trust from me, because I'd simply never been given the chance to disappoint him. I only spoke to Marguerite once, during those 5 months, at a mediation meeting neither of us wanted to be in. She looked smaller than I remembered, sitting across a conference table instead of holding court at the head of one. "You're really doing this?" she said, like it was an accusation instead of a fact, over a seating chart. This was never about a seating chart. I told her it was about 3 years of you deciding my children's future didn't matter as much as your kitchen renovation. I just didn't have proof of that until I went looking for it. She didn't have much of an answer for that. She tried, briefly, to appeal to the years we'd shared as sisters, the childhood bedroom we'd once split, as though history alone should have bought her a pass. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I remember that childhood bedroom too. I remembered it being the last time we'd ever really been equals in this family, before something in how our parents saw us quietly split us into 2 different categories of daughter. I wasn't interested in punishing her for things she hadn't chosen as a child. I was interested in what she'd chosen as an adult, with a pen in her hand 3 separate times a year for 3 years, while my children sat wherever there was room. The resolution took the better part of 5 months. The trust was ordered restored in full with the improperly redirected funds repaid from Marguerite's household assets, which meant, among other things, a lien against the dealership expansion itself. My children's share, the share that had been quietly stolen while they sat at a card table with empty plates, was recalculated, restored, and placed under independent oversight so it could never again be touched by anyone but the beneficiaries once they came of age. Marguerite lost more than money. She lost the easy assumption that she could reach into shared family resources, and nobody would ever look closely enough to notice. And that particular kind of confidence, once broken, doesn't come back easily. My father called me the week the accounting was finalized. He didn't apologize, not really. Men like my father rarely say the actual words, but he said something close to it. He said he hadn't understood how long this had been going on, that he'd been trying to keep the peace between his daughters for so many years that he'd stopped noticing whose peace kept getting sacrificed to do it. I asked him, because I finally had the standing to ask it plainly, why he'd nodded that night at the steakhouse instead of saying a single word in his grandchildren's defense. He was quiet for a long moment on the phone. I didn't want to make a scene at my own party. he finally said. I told him that was exactly the problem, that avoiding a scene had cost my children at dinner, and worse, had told them, without a single word being necessary, exactly where they ranked in his eyes. I told him I appreciated him calling, and I meant it, but I also told him, calmly, that I wouldn't be bringing my children back into a family dynamic where they sat separately and ate last, whether at a birthday table or in a family trust. If he wanted a relationship with his grandchildren going forward, it would happen on equal footing, or it wouldn't happen at all. No more separate tables, literal or otherwise. He's been trying slowly in the months since, in ways that felt small at first, and only added up over time. He drove out one Saturday in the spring for Beckett's very first baseball game, sat on a folding bleacher in the sun for 2 hours, and stayed after to tell Beckett specifically that he looked sharp out there. Not a general compliment tossed at all the kids in earshot, but a sentence aimed only at my son. He took Faye and Della to lunch on a weekday, when I couldn't get off work, just the two of them and him, and Faye told me afterward, a little stunned, that he'd asked her actual questions about middle school and waited for the whole answer instead of checking his phone. And one Sunday afternoon, he sat all 3 of my children down, one at a time, and told each of them individually that he was sorry for the birthday dinner, that he should have said something the moment it started, instead of after it had already hurt them. Beckett, who was 6 by then, told him it was okay. I didn't correct my son in the moment, but I told my father afterward, privately, that it wasn't okay. It was just forgiven, and that those weren't the same thing, and I needed him to understand the difference going forward. A birthday card for Beckett arrived on time that year with a note inside that said he was proud of him. The first time in 5 years my son had heard those words from his grandfather in writing. It's not everything. It's not the childhood I wish my kids had gotten from that side of the family from the start, but it's honest and it's earned, which is more than I ever had before. Marguerite and I don't speak. I don't say that with satisfaction, exactly. She's still my sister, and some part of me will always ache over what our relationship could have been if she'd ever once treated my children like they belonged at the same table as hers, but I've stopped waiting for that version of her to show up. I've built something steadier instead. My bookkeeping practice now supports my family entirely on its own, with enough steady clients that I finally had to turn a few away last spring for lack of hours in the day. I moved out of the apartment above the hardware store last spring, too, into a small house with a real yard, 3 actual bedrooms, and a kitchen table big enough that nobody ever has to eat somewhere else. Presley still stops by most weekends, usually with something she made too much of, and she's become more family to my kids now than half the people who share their blood. She was there the day we moved in, standing in the empty living room with a toolbox, and she looked around at the boxes and the bare walls and said, "Well, looks like somebody finally built a table big enough." Last month, Faith turned 11. We had cake in our own kitchen, all 4 of us at the same table, real plates, no one waiting for anyone else's turn. Beckett, older now, sharper, old enough to remember pieces of that steakhouse night, even if he doesn't fully understand what it meant, looked around at the 4 full plates in front of us and asked, "Everybody gets to eat at the same time here, right?" I told him that was the only rule that had ever mattered to me, and that it always would be for as long as he lived under my roof. I think about that dinner sometimes, the coats, the empty plates, my father's nod, more often than I probably should, given how far we've all come since. I used to think the worst part of that night was the humiliation of it, standing in front of a room full of people while my children were quietly told they didn't rank. I don't think that anymore. I think the worst part was almost believing for 31 years that it was normal for love to come with a seating chart, that some children simply cost less to love out loud than others, and that mine had been assigned a cheaper seat before they were even born. It took losing an entire evening with my father, and very nearly losing my footing entirely that January, to understand that the seating chart was never the real problem.